Okay, shall we start? Okay, thank you, Carina. 大家好, olá a todos. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our first online event co-hosted by the Grupo de Estudos em Direito, Recursos Naturais e Sustentabilidade, o GERN, da Universidade de Brasília, University of Brasilia Natural Resources Law and Sustainable Development Research Group, Baxilia Dashue GRN, and Wuhan Dashue Bianhaiyuan, Instituto da China de Estudos Oceânicos e de Fronteiras, da Universidade de Wuhan, Wuhan University China Institute of Boundary and Ocean Studies. I am Alexandre Pereira da Silva, and I will moderate this event, evening here in Wuhan, morning in Brazil. It's my pleasure to kick off this event. Before we get into, I should and must recognize the efforts of the co-host institutes, the GERN team in Brazil, my special thanks to Professor Carina Costa de Oliveira, and here in Wuhan, my special thanks to our team in CIBOS, my special thanks to Professor Lingjie Kong. Carina and Lingjie are the main responsibles to make this event possible. Let me extend my appreciation to our speakers and participants here in Wuhan and in Brasilia and Vinícius in New York. Let me add briefly some instructions for those who are following us on Zoom. You can use the chat or Q&A function, or those who are following us on YouTube, you can use the Slido, I guess, if I'm not wrong. The people in Brazil, the team in Brazil will give some support. Your participation is much welcome and appreciated. Thanks very much for being with us. Sorry. So on tonight here and today, this morning in Brazil, we're going to discuss legal issues on BBNJ negotiations and environmental governments in Antarctica, sharing views between Brazil and China. So we have a bit tight schedule, but so we tried our best to do on time. So without further ado, let's move to the opening remarks and invite Professor Márcio Iório Aranha and Professor Lingjie Kong for the opening remarks. So firstly, I'd like to invite Professor Márcio Iório Aranha. Professor Aranha is Associate Professor of Constitutional and Administrative Law at the University of Brasilia School of Law and Dean of the Research Center on Communication Policy, Law, Economics, and Technology. Welcome, Professor Aranha. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I would like to thank this prospective partnership on researching biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction in Antarctica. And I commend Professors Lingjie Kong and Carina Oliveira for this initiative. I'm here on behalf of the University of Brasilia School of Law Center on Law and Regulation, which hosts the Natural Resources Law and Sustainable Development Research Group, coordinated by Professor Carina Oliveira. That research group articulates nationally and internationally sustainability, human rights, environmental law, economic law, law of the sea, and civil law, and has been an important player in Brazil for more than 10 years in guiding policy and regulation on a myriad of topics concerning biodiversity. Thank you to the organizers for one more important venue of discussion on relevant topics. I hope you have a productive day of discussions and that this initiative prospers as intended. And without further ado, thank you very much, Professor Lingjie Kong. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Márcio Iório Aranha, for your words. Let me briefly introduce Professor Lingjie Kong. Professor Lingjie Kong is Professor of International Law and Associate Dean for Research and International Cooperation at Wuhan University, China Institute of Boundary and Ocean Studies. Lingjie is also a founding member of the International Water Law Academy at Wuhan University. It's great, Lingjie, to have you here. And again, thanks for your support, engagement to host or co-host our event together with Carina and the GERN. Lingjie, welcome, and the floor is always yours.
Oh, thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Márcio, for your kind words. On behalf of the Dean of CIBOS, Professor Jinyuan Su, I would like to welcome you all to this joint event co-hosted by University of Brasilia and Wuhan University China Institute of Boundary and Ocean Studies. I would like also to extend our appreciation to Alexandra and Carina for coordinating and making this great event happen today. I would also thank all the speakers you're about to present in a couple of minutes. And I volunteer to be a discussant. So I will also be very short and brief. I will listen very carefully and try to learn and exchange ideas with the four speakers. So with that, I will conclude and pass the microphone back to Alexandra.
Thank you. Thanks, Lingjie, for your opening remarks, as well as Márcio. To be honest with all of you, I'm delighted to be here virtually with Brazilians and Chinese colleagues, and our friend Otto, our Dutch professor here in Wuhan. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for our main panel. It's exactly Professor Otto Spijkers. Professor Spijkers is Professor of International Law here at Wuhan University China Institute of Boundary Studies, as well as in the Research Institute of Environmental Law, and founding staff member of the International Water Law Academy. Welcome, Otto. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. Wait. Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, excellent. So my presentation is about the formal relationship between the international legally binding instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction, on the one hand, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the other hand. And as you can see, people that are specializing in this topic, they really like their alphabet soup. So I'm going to use a lot of abbreviations. So I'm going to refer to the ILB from now on. That's the international legally binding instrument that's being developed. And I'm going to refer to BBNJ. And I'm going to refer to UNCLOS or LOSC, but UNCLOS, it sounds better. So why do we need a new treaty on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction? Well, there are basically three reasons. First of all, the existing regime is highly fragmented, so some marine protected areas have been established in some parts of the high seas. but there's no coherence. And also some migratory marine species like whales are protected properly by their own convention, but others are not. So again, fragmentation. And also very few general obligations exist, and those that do exist are extremely vague and extremely general, bordering almost on meaninglessness. Think of part 12 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which is devoted to the protection of the marine environment, and its main provision, so that would be Article 192 of the Law of the Sea Convention. It basically says, and I quote, "States have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment," end of quote. So that is a very general obligation, and it's not clear what that entails exactly. Also, and that is the third and final reason, some activities that are undertaken in the high seas, they seem to escape entirely from regulation. So there are some regulatory gaps in the law of the sea. Think of the exploitation of marine genetic resources. That's a big issue at the moment, and whether this is regulated at all. So that is why we need this new treaty. So because I'm the first speaker, I thought it might be useful to give a very brief overview of this BBNJ process before turning specifically to the main topic of my presentation. That's the relationship between the ILB and the UNCLOS. So basically, you can identify 3 phases in this BBNJ process. So in 2006, so that's a really long time ago, the UN General Assembly convened an ad hoc open-ended informal working group to study issues relating to the BBNJ. And this open-ended working group, it met 4 times in the period 2006-2011. And the group reached a key agreement at its 4th and final meeting in 2011. So there it was suggested that a process be initiated by the United Nations General Assembly with a view to ensuring that the legal framework for the conservation and sustainable use of the BBNJ effectively addresses those issues by identifying gaps and ways forward, including through the implementation of existing instruments and the possible development of a multilateral agreement under the Law of the Sea Convention. And so the conclusion of a new treaty. And this process should address the conservation and sustainable use of the BBNJ. And in particularly, it should deal with 4 issues, and this is important. It should deal with marine genetic resources. It should deal with marine protected areas. It should deal with environmental impact assessments. And finally, it should deal with capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And those 4 issues that were identified in 2011 by this working group, they together constitute the so-called package deal that is still the core of the BBNJ process. Then in 2015, the UN General Assembly decided to establish a preparatory committee. So that's phase 2 of the BBNJ process. And this preparatory committee also convened 4 times in the period 2016 to 2017. And it decided in 2017 that an international conference should be convened and the formal negotiations should be started. So following more than a decade of discussions convened under the UN General Assembly, the Assembly in 2007 decided to convene an intergovernmental conference on the BBNJ. And this IGC, this conference, was mandated again to meet 4 times. And it already met 3 times, but the 4th and final meeting has constantly been postponed. And it's now likely to take place in August of this year, but that's still not finally decided. But that's the plan, that there is a international conference meeting in August of 2021. And what is interesting is that at this stage, we already have a text. And so for the first time in August of 2019, the negotiations were done on the basis of a text, a zero draft, that was basically prepared by President Rena Lee, president of the conference. She's from Singapore. And I actually met her in person quite a few times because she used to be the ambassador of Singapore in the Netherlands. So she knows the Netherlands quite well, and she's often there. So she prepared this zero draft in August of 2019. And then in November of 2019, she published a revised draft text of the ILB. And the rest of my presentation is basically a discussion of that revised text. So I've selected the relevant parts of that document. So let me now turn to the main theme of my presentation, the relationship between the ILB and the Loft Sea Convention. So in 2017, this preparatory committee already suggested that the new ILB should make explicit that nothing in it should prejudice the rights, jurisdiction, and duties of states under the Loft Sea Convention, and also that the new ILB should be interpreted and applied in the context of and in a manner consistent with the Loft Sea Convention. So then that may raise the question, what are then the relevant rights and duties in the Loft Sea Convention that this new ILB should carefully avoid not to prejudice? But before I want to head-on address this question, I want to say a few general words about this relationship. So the relationship between the new ILB and the Loft Sea Convention is reflected very clearly in the proposal to see the new ILB as an instrument under the Loft Sea Convention. I mean, this word is even used in its title, provisional title. So it suggests, and I think this is becoming more and more clear as the negotiations advance, it suggests that the new ILB should be like an implementing agreement of the Loft Sea Convention. I think of the agreement implementing Part 11 of the Loft Sea Convention on matters related to the area, or think of the agreement for the implementation of the provisions of the Loft Sea Convention relating to the conservation and the management of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. So the ILB should be this kind of animal, an implementation agreement. But even if that's not the proper way to understand the relationship, it's clear that there is a certain hierarchy with the Constitution of the Oceans, as the Loft Sea Convention is often called, on top of that hierarchy, and the new ILB just below it. And this hierarchical relationship is different from the ILB's relationship with other existing agreements, like the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the ILB must be fully consistent with the Loft Sea Convention, and it should not undermine other existing legal instruments like the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this not undermine condition does not apply to the Loft Sea Convention, it only applies to other international legal agreements, and also to frameworks and relevant global, regional, and sectoral bodies that exist under the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. So the ILB should show respect for the balance of rights and obligations achieved under the Loft Sea Convention. And the new ILB should also build on the relevant principles of the Loft Sea Convention and not derogate from them. Think of the high seas freedoms, think of the due regard principle, and so on. So that should be properly reflected in the new ILB. Also, it should be consistent with the Loft Sea Convention. And that means, inter alia, that the meaning of terms used in the ILB should be consistent with the meaning of those same terms in the Loft Sea Convention. So if the new ILB refers to the marine environment, it should be understood in the same way as it is understood in the Loft Sea Convention. So I now wanted to look at very briefly at the relevant parts in this revised draft text of November 2019. And so from the preamble and the text, we can, or the title, sorry, we can already see the special relationship between the convention. So all references to the convention are references to the Loft Sea Convention. If we read the preamble, it's very clear that we should always keep in mind the relevant parts of the Loft Sea Convention. And this becomes even more clear in the operative parts of the revised draft, especially in general Article 2 and Article 4. And so Article 2 says the objective of this agreement, the ILB, is to ensure the long-term conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction through effective implementation of the relevant provisions of the convention and further international cooperation and coordination. So it even uses the word implementation. So clearly it's an implementation agreement of the Loft Sea Convention. And you will note that this text is not put in brackets. So there is a consensus on this provision, on the text of this provision. So then if you look at Article 4, which talks about this relationship in a little bit more detail, you should compare the paragraphs 1 and 3. So 1 is about the relationship between the ILB and the Loft Sea Convention, and 3 is about the relationship between the ILB and other international agreements. So 1 says, nothing in this agreement shall prejudice the rights, jurisdiction, and duties of states under the Loft Sea Convention, and this agreement shall be interpreted and applied in the context of and in a manner consistent with that convention. And paragraph 3 says this agreement shall be interpreted and applied in a manner that does not undermine relevant legal instruments. And so here the term does not undermine is used. And if you then look at more detailed provisions in this zero draft, again, the word implement is used in Article 14. And Article 15 also has this reference to the due regard principle, which is of course taken from the Loft Sea Convention. And also in Articles 21, operationalize the provisions of the convention. Again, that sounds a lot like implementation. Article 22, paragraph 2, on the basis of Articles 204, 206 of the convention. Again, operationalizing the more general obligations that already exist under the Loft Sea Convention. So that is basically what I wanted to say. So a brief overview of the BBNJ process I have provided. And then I have looked at some parts of the latest text that is put on the table. So this text that I've been quoting from in the last couple of minutes, that is the text that is now the basis of the negotiations that will hopefully resume in August of 2021. But that's not 100% sure yet, and not 100% certain yet. And also the modality of those negotiations is not clear. Whether this will be an online conference or whether it will be an on-site conference or some kind of hybrid model. And it's not even clear. I mean, the August session is supposed to be the last one, but even that is not clear. They might add an additional session. So I am wondering if there are any questions. And in case you're wondering, the guy on the picture, that is me, scuba diving in Egypt. So I was, I look forward to hearing any questions or comments on my presentation. And thank you for taking the time and the patience to listen to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. Thank you for your presentation, for the overview towards the negotiations towards an international legal binding agreement. Moving on to our next speaker is Professor Carina Oliveira. Professor Carina Oliveira is Professor of International Law at Environmental Law, Natural Resources and Sustainability Research Group. She's also a coordinator of the research group on law and natural resources and sustainability at University of Brasilia. Welcome, Carina, and thanks again for your support, engagement to make this event possible. Please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Alexandre. I would like to thank Professor Alexandre and Professor Lingjie Kong for the co-organization of this webinar. I'm sure that this is the first of many future projects. And I would also like to thank all the professors, researchers, and students that kindly accepted to participate and to contribute to the debate here at Zoom and also at YouTube. So my presentation will add one element to the debate. I'll try to share my screen. Just a minute. I think it's okay, right? Okay. So I will add one element to the debate, which is, well, the title of my presentation is The Possible Contributions of the Future BBNJ Legally Binding Instrument to Avoid Biodiversity Litigation. So the biodiversity litigation topic is connected to a project in which I am participating, coordinated by Professors Sandrine Maljean-Dubois, Professor Guillaume Futsar, and John Hazaki. And for this webinar, I thought it would be interesting to join the BBNJ Future Treaty and biodiversity litigation, being the first one instrument to avoid the second one, to avoid biodiversity litigation. So this is a work in progress, and I will present you some ideas on the topic. So the outline of my presentation will be the following one. I will start with an introduction by pointing out the definition of international biodiversity litigation, then pointing out some leading cases and the influence of international biodiversity law on national law. And then I will divide in two different parts. The first one, the possible contributions of BBNJ to avoid international biodiversity litigation, and the contributions on general principles, on definitions, and on obligations. And then the second part will present the possible contributions of BBNJ to avoid national biodiversity litigation, and then the contributions on general principles, on definitions, and on obligations too. So the definition of international biodiversity litigation is the following one. Any legal dispute at the national, regional, or international level that concerns conservation of, sustainable use of, and access and benefit sharing to the genetic resources, species, ecosystems, and their relations. And well, we can see that international biodiversity treaties have been increasingly invoked before international and national tribunals. And I have selected here some cases that are connected to some issues that have been discussed during BBNJ negotiations. So the cases in yellow, so there are cases, there are advisory opinions, and there are some awards as well. And the ones that are in yellow, they are, well, directly connected with the sea, and the others, they are connected with topics that have been discussed during BBNJ negotiations. And here we can see that there are the subjects that are connected to these cases are environmental principles, definitions, due diligence or due regard, protection of the marine environment and species, transboundary disputes, environmental impact assessment, protected area, and cases from different tribunals, such as the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the dispute settlement body of the WTO, World Trade Organization, the International Court of Justice, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and so on. So we can see different topics related to, for instance, the area, which is the case 17 from ITLUS, on the responsibilities and obligations of states sponsoring persons and entities with respect to activities in the area. And then cases related to whales, for instance, the whaling in Antarctica case, ICJ case, and then cases related to, for example, related to trade, for example, shrimp turtles case, seals case, tuna case. So we can see that there is a jurisprudence on different issues related to BBNJ negotiations. So these leading cases that were selected here, these 15 cases, they happened from 1997 to 2018, and they are directly or indirectly connected to BBNJ. And the second point is the influence of international biodiversity law on national law. So this point, I would say that it's quite important. For instance, Brazilian law referred to biodiversity for the first time when the Convention on Biological Diversity was ratified in 1998 and was internalized in Brazil in 1998. So even if BBNJ will regulate areas beyond national jurisdiction, its definitions, obligations, and principles can impact on national law. And we see here, for example, in Brazil, that there is an important biodiversity litigation that can also be avoided by some of these obligations, principles, and definitions that can be brought by this future treaty. So my first part related to the possible contributions to avoid international biodiversity law, biodiversity litigation. I will point out some general principles and some definitions and obligations that can contribute to avoid biodiversity litigation. So the first one is the precautionary principle. We can see that, well, at the beginning, it was not recognized by cases judged, for instance, by WTO, the World Trade Organization dispute settlement, such as the biotech case. However, I would say that after this case, other advisory opinions or other cases in different tribunals started to mention the precautionary principle and as principle, sometimes as approach. And now the debates related to the BBNJ draft still ask the question whether approach or principle should be used. And I think that today we can affirm that international and national law give support to the precautionary principle. So BBNJ should enlighten the principle in order to consolidate its legal status. And well, the second one is the principle of common heritage of mankind, which was mentioned by the advisory opinion number 17 under ITLUS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And this case, it gave some environmental content to the principle. However, the principle still needs to be consolidated. And one first step for this consolidation was done by the Biological Diversity Convention, which uses the terminology of common concern of humankind for biodiversity in the preamble. So BBNJ should consolidate that benefit sharing of genetic resources is justified by the principle of common heritage. So in this sense, I would say that non-living and genetic resources should have the same legal status of a principle and under the principle of the common heritage of mankind. The second point is the contributions on definitions to avoid some biodiversity litigation. And one example is the ICJ case on whaling in Antarctica. And I would say that the lack of some definitions, such as marine scientific research or bioprospecting in international law, does not enliven limits between these terms, the limits between marine scientific research, bioprospecting, exploitation, exploration. So in many parts of the draft, it says, for instance, at Article 8, that the provision of this part shall not apply to marine scientific research. However, there is no definition on what is marine scientific research. So I think that these type of definitions should be included in the document in order to avoid litigation, as was seen in the whaling in Antarctica ICJ case. Regarding obligations, so the contributions to avoid biodiversity litigation on some obligations. There are important contributions that the BBNJ future treaty can contribute concerning, for instance, environmental impact assessment. So there is a jurisprudence on the customary status of the international obligation to conduct environmental impact assessment, so some cases related directly or indirectly to the ocean. And these customary obligation as a due diligence obligation, but there are still many procedural and substantial uncertainties related to this obligation, and this is reflected on the debates of BBNJ negotiations on EIA. So BBNJ should harmonize these some minimum criteria for the environmental impact assessment elaboration, even if the study is done by states regulating the areas that can impact an area beyond national jurisdiction. And these minimum criteria should take into account cumulative, socioeconomic, and transboundary impacts in order to prevent biodiversity litigation, as was seen in many different transboundary disputes under international tribunals. And concerning protected areas, I would say that substantial and procedure issues should be clarified by BBNJ treaty in order to avoid cases such as Chagos case between Mauritius and UK. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration contributed a bit to clarify what is and what can and what cannot be considered as a marine protected area. But I think that BBNJ can really contribute to clarify the use of this type of instrument. So as per, oops, sorry, I think, can you see my, don't know what happened, but I can't see my presentation anymore. Are you, can you see my presentation?
No, it's stopped. Yeah, the PPT.
I don't know what happened. Up. Let me.
Carina, we can see, but it's not moving. You're still on the same page.
Let me do it again. Up. Is it okay now?
Yes, now it moved.
Okay. So I will be very brief here. The possible contributions to avoid national biodiversity litigation. Now I I pass to the second part, and then I can point out the contributions to avoid biodiversity litigations on general principles and approaches such as non-regression principle and integrated approach. So I would like to point out this example of the non-regression principle. In Brazil, biodiversity litigation has been evolving from an aim at seeking a remedy for the purpose of raising awareness. So due to the regression in biodiversity protection occurred in the last years, we can see a trend to use the non-regression principle in biodiversity litigation in order to reduce this type of regression. So on a recent case in Brazil related to the change in parameters to protect native vegetation in the country, such as coastal ecosystems, there was the non-regression principle was used to interrupt normative changes, and provisionally, by a provisional measure, the Supreme Court accepted the use of this principle. And in this sense, I would say that BBNJ inclusion of this principle on the test will strengthen the principle and will contribute to prevent litigation under international and national law as well. And the same thing can be said about the integrated approach that could be strengthened by the ratification of BBNJ. And in the same perspective, Brazil has a fragmented management of coastal and marine space, and there is a lot of litigation on that, and this could be avoided by strengthening the use of this approach, the integrated approach. And of course, on definitions and on obligations as well, definitions such as strategic environmental assessment can contribute to the implementation of this integrated approach, and obligations regarding EIAs, based on the fact that states will probably have the obligation to conduct EIAs for activities that can impact areas beyond national jurisdiction. BBNJ can provide minimum criteria for these obligations. So my conclusions are that biodiversity litigation is key to guarantee biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of it. However, it's better to avoid it through instruments such as BBNJ, and BBNJ can also impact on the decrease in national biodiversity litigation based on the provision of strategic principles, definitions, and obligations. So this is the end of my presentation. I thank you for your kind participation.
Thank you, Carina. It was very interesting, and it's a quite fascinating issue. So let's move on to our third speaker. Is Professor Jinyuan Su. Jinyuan Su is professor at Wuhan University Institute of International Law. He has published extensively in the last year, not only on law of the sea, as well as in international air law and space law. Thanks, Professor Su, for being with us. Welcome, and please, the floor is yours. It's your mic, Professor Su. It's you need to unmute your microphone.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
It took me some time to find the button. Okay. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for your very kind invitation. And good morning, good evening to everybody depending on your time zone. My name is Jinyuan Su, and I, together with Professor Lingjie Kong, Alexandra, Otto, we are in the same big family, but we sort of also belong to different small families at Wuhan University. So my presentation will be on the adjacency doctrine in the negotiation of BBNJ. So the term adjacency doctrine is taken to comprise, a bunch of arguments or proposals in the negotiation of BBNJ, which argues for preferential rights for coastal states on the issues. So the idea is not to deny or endorse, these arguments categorically, but to try to differentiate, which are legitimate, which are not. So the presentation will consist of 3 sections. Each of them correspond to some arguments, legal basis, raised for these arguments in the negotiation of BBNJ. So first of all is the question whether adjacency is a legal principle under existing law of the sea, and whether it should be so. And second of all is on the question of access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources straddling the boundary between ABNJ and areas within national jurisdiction. So it's limited only on those marine genetic resources which are shared, between ABNJ and AWNJ, rather than marine genetic resources in general. And the third question is the role of adjacent coastal states in the measures taken for and activities conducted in ABNJ. So at the outset, it might be, helpful to highlight, the school of or the doctrine of adjacency is dynamic, in the sense that throughout the negotiation, it has been changing constantly. So in the earlier period of the negotiation, in particular the pre-com, some extreme proposals were tabled. For instance, it was argued that, for example, for those measures taken in the ABNJ, the consent of the adjacent coastal states are required. But now these extreme proposals, some of them have been abandoned. So it's quite dynamic. It is also important, I thought, to highlight, and Otto has mentioned this too, the negotiation of BBNJ has very strict mandate given by the UNGA, in the sense that the work and the result of the conference should be fully consistent with the provisions of the UNCLOS. So we should keep this in mind when we talk about the possible new developments, in the negotiation. So first of all, whether adjacency is a legal principle, and this was proposed in particular by the Pacific Small Island Developing States at the second session of pre-com, at the fourth session in the pre-com, and this was also included in the President's Aid to Negotiation, which was released in December 2018. But we should also note that this President's Aid does not really reflect the President's preference. It simply summarized the ideas, which appeared, which were proposed in the pre-com. Adjacency as a principle did not appear in the draft text agreement or the revised draft text agreement, but it cannot be ruled out that it would revive sometime in the future. It is possible, although I saw it minimal. And second of all, although adjacency is not taken as a legal principle, there are concrete rules which were proposed, for instance, with regard to access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources, with regard to ABMTs, with regard to EIAs, which are based on this doctrine. So it is acting like a shadow behind these proposals of rules. So I thought it's helpful to examine the status of adjacency under international law. adjacency, as many scholars take, consists of at least two elements. One is distance, the other is continuity. And if we see the development of the law of the sea, the development of various maritime zones, we can see that quite clearly that it had definitely played a role in the development of maritime entitlements. For instance, territorial sea, continental shelf, exclusive economic zone. Some of them may combine these two elements. For instance, continental shelf is based upon two criteria. One is natural prolongation, the other is distance. And for instance, the exclusive economic zone is based upon distance only. So it's without doubt it played a role, or it can be regarded as a basis for maritime entitlements. But is it a legal principle? And I think this question has been addressed quite explicitly in the Gulf of Maine case. And when the chamber responded to Canada's argument based on adjacency, and it said, here I would like to highlight, it said that the boundary resulted from a rule of law, not from any intrinsic merit in the purely physical sense. In the chamber's opinion, it is therefore correct to say that international law confers on the coastal state a legal title to an adjacent continental shelf or to a maritime zone adjacent to its coasts. It would not be correct to say that international law recognizes the title conferred on the state by the adjacency of that shelf or that zone, as if the mere natural fact of adjacency produced legal consequences. And I think the chamber made it very clear. I think it recognized adjacency as a basis of entitlements, but it denied the status of adjacency as a legal principle in itself. To endorse the adjacency as a legal principle would run the risk of breaking up or upsetting the very delicate balance stricken between the rights of coastal states and those of the international community in the UNCLOS, which I think is essential to the international community's endorsement of the convention. So having said that, as I have mentioned earlier, although adjacency is not proposed as a legal principle any longer, this voice is not quite strong in the negotiation now. But there are various rules which have been proposed based on this idea. One is the argument for preferential rights in the access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources, in particular those straddling the boundary between ABNJ and AWNJ. And this is what was proposed by the Philippine delegation at the fourth session of PRECOM. It argued for the application of the adjacency principle in the access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources by invoking the adjacent states' stewardship of marine genetic resources, its contribution to the conservation of habitats of marine genetic resources, or its significant contribution to the management and conservation of marine genetic resources. Here, the Philippines does not seem to, focus on marine genetic resources, which has a shared nature, or in other words, those straddling a boundary between ABNJ and AWNJ. But I think those having a shared nature is a very unique marine genetic resources. So the idea here is to examine whether the regime of access and the benefit sharing for marine genetic resources, those straddling the boundary between ABNJ and AWNJ, should afford coastal states preferential rights. And if not, there's no reason to afford such preferential rights for adjacent coastal states on marine genetic resources in general. It might be helpful in this connection to see the legal regimes for the access and benefit sharing of other shared resources. For shared living resources, is simply follow the location-based approach for access, and usually there's no obligation of benefit sharing, although there is an obligation to cooperate. between coastal states and fishing states on the conservation and promotion of optimal use. By contrast, shared non-living resources, they may be easier to apportion because they are in a relatively static nature status. So, for instance, there are some oil or gas deposits, which straddle the boundary between the continental shelf and the area. Although sometimes it may also, travel a little bit if one side tend to, exploit some on its side. But in comparison to the, for instance, the straddling or highly migratory fishes is easier to apportion. The existing law provides for the obligation of consultation with a view to avoiding infringement of the rights and interests of coastal states. And there's also an obligation of prior consent, where activities in the area may result in the exploitation of resources lying within national jurisdiction. So I think this is normal because non-living resources is much more easier to apportion between the international community and coastal states. Now, the current draft, the revised draft test agreement, provides for the obligation of prior notification and consultation of the coastal states if there's a possibility, to jeopardize the rights and interest of adjacent coastal states in the utilization of many genetic resources. So I think this is a very reasonable provision, and I do not see much disagreement on this provision in the negotiation currently. Third of all, the role of adjacent coastal states in measures taken for and activities conducted in ABNJ. For instance, at the first session of PRECOM, it was proposed that the new ABMTs must respect existing ones established by coastal states in AWNJ adjacent to ABNJ. And similar proposals were made at the second session. Of course, there were some quite extreme proposals too. For instance, it was argued that coastal states should give their prior consent for activities conducted in ABNJ and or the measures taken in ABNJ. But these proposals, however, were abandoned, as the negotiation proceeded. So I thought it was helpful to differentiate two types of activities and measures. For activities conducted in ABNJ, they are usually harmful, to more or less degree, harmful to the environment. And second of all, for measures taken in the ABNJ, those protective measures, they are overall protective. It's just a matter of more protection or less protection. So for activities conducted in ABNJ, the obligation to avoid transboundary harm is definitely applicable. And you must be very familiar with this obligation. It has its origin even in the Roman law. And it was stated in the 1941 trial smelter case between Canada and US. And then in the Stockholm Declaration and Rio Declaration, it pick up an or a facet, which we call it erga omnes nowadays. And it is also regarded as a rule of customary intention law in several cases before the International Court of Justice. With regard to environmental impact assessment, it's not only a treaty obligation under UNCLOS, but also regarded as a rule of customary international law by the International Court of Justice and its laws as well. And I think the obligation of EIA is applicable just as the obligation of avoiding transboundary harm. And the current version of the BBNJ agreement requires for the obligation of public notification and consultation. And I think this is a very good mechanism by which the coastal states can participate in the decision-making with regard to activities conducted in ABNJ. It may go, a little bit too far if the consent of adjacent coastal states is required. Having said that, it is possible that if transboundary environmental harm is caused, the entity which conducts the activity may be responsible for the harm caused. And second of all, with regard to the measures taken in the ABNJ, and there are similarly, a variety of proposals which were made. For instance, the requirement of consent, requirement of no determined undermining effect, the obligation of cooperation, and the obligation of due regard. Some delegations invoke Article 7 in particular of the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement to argue for the obligation of not to undermine the effectiveness of measures in AWNJ, as and this is what is now appearing in Article 15, paragraph 4 of the revised draft text agreement. But we should also notice that in the Fish Stocks Agreement, it also emphasizes on the mutual obligation to cooperate, and so this is what I think is quite inadequately addressed in the current version of the BBNJ agreement. If the provision on focusing on the obligation not to undermine the effectiveness of measures in AWNJ is upheld, it also runs the risk of extending coastal state jurisdiction further into the sea, potentially hindering the freedom of high seas navigation, high seas freedom. I mean, another proposal which was suspected or which was not so well accepted at the beginning is the obligation of due regard. Criticisms was raised on this obligation for its vagueness, for example, but we can see, in a number of cases, for instance, the Chagos MPA arbitration, and also the more recent, Enrica Lexi incident arbitration between Italy and India. I think they have clarified, to a great extent, the obligation of due regard. So the essence is to strike a balance between different rights and to conduct, carry out consultation if necessary. So I'm personally very glad to see the obligation of due regard is now written, quite strongly in the current version. And also there's also a question of decision making in measures taken in the ABNJ. And similarly, it is proposed that those measures should be taken with full consultation with adjacent coastal states. And I think it affords the coastal states a very sufficient mechanism for their participation in the decision making. So by this, I conclude my presentation, and thank you. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Professor Jinyuan Su, for your presentation. And I forgot to mention, and I like to invite all the speakers and participation to read Professor Su's most recent publication on ocean development international law, called the same title of his presentation, called the paper he calls "The Adjacent Doctrine in Negotiations on BBNJ, Creeping Jurisdiction, or Legitimate Claim." Thanks again, Professor Su. And let's move to our fourth speaker, is Professor Ana Flávia Barros-Platiau. Professor Ana Flávia Barros-Platiau is professor at the International Relations Institute in the University of Brasilia and director of the Brazilian Research Center at Earth System Governments Network. Thank you, Professor Barros-Platiau, for being with us. And please, the floor or the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Alexandre Pereira. Thank you, Professor Carina Oliveira, Professor Lingjie Kong. Ni hao. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to share my thoughts with you. And as you've noticed, I will talk about Brazil and about international law, but it's concerning BBNJ and Antarctica. So I think I will have a more focused view on a specific issue related to Brazil. First of all, as I teach international relations in the University of Brasilia, and I'm part of the GERN group with Professor Carina, under the leadership of Professor Carina Oliveira. So I decided to pick up the concept of strategic diplomacy, and please let me tell you the story of this concept. For me, 8 years ago, Professor Carina invited me for a project about Brazilian strategic management of living resources, ocean living resources. And the first question was, what strategic management, what strategic policy does that exist in Brazil? So after that, we started working on everything we could find, of course, national law, international obligations, institutions, actors, and all that. And then I thought that the principle of strategic diplomacy would be very useful to understand the Brazilian role concerning all the debate that we've just had. So there's a theoretical background based on the works of Evelyn Goh and Johan Pranten from the Australian National University. And a very simple definition to try to go very fast. It's the policy to position, prepare, and nudge national systems into what they call the zone of resilience. In the case of our research is to try to understand how Brazil prepares its foreign policy and how it reacts to inputs from multilateral arenas of negotiation. So I'm the other side of the story, let's say. The concept of a strategic diplomacy has 3 points, put very in a simple way here. First of all, the end point, meaning what does Brazil want? Who are we talking about? What are the main actors and stakeholders? And the second point, the entry point, how to engage, how to go for it. And the third point, tipping points when where their system changes. So I'll try to explain that now. First of all, what does Brazil want and who are we talking about? According to what we've done as research in the last couple of years, based on official documents, data like the national strategy, the white book on defense, white paper on defense, a book called The Road Ahead, organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with diplomats as policy planners, national archives, and official websites, and so on. We try to answer questions, and we found that the 3 main aims of Brazil are, first of all, security and defense. Of course, because the army is very involved in the Brazilian government now. And one of the criteria that we found is also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's a big division of, there was a new reform, and the division for ocean, Antarctica, and space is under a bigger structure that's called sensible issues, that also encompasses military and security issues inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Second point, the main aims of Brazil, international cooperation, and we took the example of scientific research and of course the many treaties that Brazil signed, and other international instruments. One that's very interesting and is the most recent is the Copenhagen Accord on fighting IUU fishing. And the third point, economic interests that are not clearly expressed in all the documents we have, but of course it's very important, and one of the signs of that importance is the expansion of the Brazilian continental platform and the Brazilian interest of drilling for oil, for example. And the main actors, it's the executive power, normally the presidential cabinet, the armed force, and the Itamaraty, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also a very interesting structure that was created a couple of decades ago. That it was composed of several ministries in the past, but we highlight that there's only 3 or 4 that are really important to this issue we're discussing here today. The second point, how to engage or start, what has Brazil decided to do, what did Brazil choose to do? And the results we found were international cooperation, of course, participation in multilateral talks, to have voice and sometimes even leadership. In the case of Antarctica, Brazil has been participating but not proposing position papers so frequently, so voice is not so loud. In the BBNJ case, Vinícius is here with us, one of the diplomats in charge of negotiations, so he can give you the details. But Brazil has been working very hard and trying to defend its interests, its point of view, especially regarding MGRs, and very close to Brazilian law on access to biological resources. Scientific research, that's a very interesting point, and I would like to highlight it because the data about scientific research concerning Antarctica and BBNJ is not complete. We are looking for it, and if you have data, Alexandre, I'd like to share that with you. We are trying to map out from the websites of the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Education, the funding agencies, trying to find who are the people effectively working on scientific research. And we found out there's much more that's not been totally described yet. So we can only see the top of the iceberg in Brazil. Regional initiatives that are on paper, but they do not really exist, or they are very limited now. And finally, and obviously, joint military training. That's not so interesting for us here, but it exists and it is important concerning both cases. And the third point, where the system changes, and is China a game changer? That's my most recent research. I'm very happy to discuss that with the Chinese. Very quickly, as an IR professor, of course, China is a game changer because China has grown so much, so fast, has so much technology, is doing a lot of work, especially concerning Antarctica. But this does not mean that China should be seen as a threat or a big game changer. Probably there will be other countries who will be the candidates to be the game changer, not China. Concerning BBNJ, there was a big system change in when the UN decided to start discussing the international legally binding instrument, so I'll not go to it. And it was already mentioned that next year, or maybe in the end of this year, we will have a text open for signature. And the big change in Brazil was 2019, because there was a new government elected and many priorities changed in Brazil. So as far as I understand, BBNJ had a big change from government views in the case of priorities and case of institutional arrangements. But this big change does not mean that everything changed. Brazil continued to follow the same diplomatic priorities, although BBNJ was not discussed in the public debate, national debate in Brazil. So what I'm saying is that there was a big change in terms of national policies, but not in terms of foreign policy. It was disconnected, and it happens a lot frequently in IR. And concerning Antarctica, also just 2012, because that was when the scientific station burned, Brazilian only scientific station burned. Brazil was compelled to cooperate with other countries, cooperate more, ask for favors. Brazil worked a lot with different countries. Scientists had to go on foreign ships. Even the Chinese ship invited Brazilian researchers to help. And many other countries also did, the Spanish, the British, the French, and many other cooperation initiatives started. There will probably be the big change, but I believe, or we believe, it's going to be well before 2048, as usually legal scholars or even IR observers understand. Why? Because international relations is changing so fast. 2048 is very far away. It's going to be a total different international order. And in Brazil, there was a big change last year concerning Antarctica, because the new scientific station was finally inaugurated. It was built up by Chinese companies. It's very beautiful, it's wonderful, it's modern. Scientists are very happy about that. I didn't visit it yet, but one day I will. But I know that it's great. The problem is, the big change is funding for research. So we have two big challenges. One is COVID-19, of course, and the next mission to Antarctica. And the second one is funding for research. The situation in Brazil now is very bad, it's very risky. Scientists are afraid they will not have the funding to go and work in the new scientific station. So that's why it's very important to highlight this big issue about Antarctica. And in terms of policy networks, I presented this in the International Studies Association this year as a result of another project. And this was related to the Blue Amazon, means the Brazilian waters. But the interministerial commission is the same. So the most important actors are defense in the center, and then foreign affairs, science and technology, environment, and mining before 2020. And after 2020, we understand that the environment is getting smaller and the others are getting bigger to go very fast. But it's very different from Antarctica, although it's the same commission. Changes were smaller, but we have defense forces, the army, especially the army and the navy, in the center of the decision-making process, together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Science and Technology. And again, the environment getting smaller. I would even exclude it now, since 2 years ago, but my colleagues decided we should keep environment as, I would say, wishful thinking, but it's there, and let's hope it gets bigger in the future. So what I'm trying to show with the two policy networks is, although we have the same structure, the same legal obligations, the same actors, they function in a very different way. So Brazilian foreign policy related to both cases are must be compared because they are very different. And the results, as I said, they are two different policy networks. Blue Amazon does not fit for BBNJ. BBNJ, as I said, is totally different negotiation. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is taking very good care of these negotiations with the CLAM group, for example, the core Latin American group, and also contact with researchers, the Ministry of Environment, and other stakeholders, the Ministry of Science and Technology, but it's not inside the Blue Amazon policy network we mentioned before. And roughly, so we have the same actors, but they evolved different over time. They're not well connected in terms of agendas, authorities, and priorities. Defense authorities are in the center for Antarctica, and I would say Itamaraty, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is in the center for BBNJ. And so the final remarks, Brazil does not have a strategic diplomacy framework yet, but it has some pieces of this big puzzle. And I intend to contribute to my country by proposing that they think more in terms of a big strategy, like other countries, like Portugal, for example, that has a minister for ocean affairs. Also, there were major political shifts that they do not necessarily affect the policy networks. Each policy network functions different depending on the distribution of power and on the agenda. So it's not depending on law. It's not only depending on law. Law is certainly the basis, the starting point, but afterwards, the interpretation of the legal obligations depend a lot on the government and the power struggles, the political power struggles, including with National Congress in Brazil. And agendas, authorities, and priorities are not connected properly within the networks. And this is a data analysis, and I'm going very fast here. I didn't put the numbers to show you how we got to this conclusion. And it's not published yet. And Brazilian geopolitics needs to engage better with the global risk priorities. What I mean there is that Brazil is not, for example, following what's happening in the Arctic from a very strategic perspective, let's say. So Brazil has a lot of work to do in terms of diplomatic strategy or to get connected to this global picture of what's going on. And that's where BBNJ is totally important, because it must not be disconnected from scientific research, trade, geopolitics, and all that other agendas. And so those are the most references I used for the concept of strategic diplomacy. And finally, our book has lots of chapters in English. It's available on the GERN website if you want to take a look at it. And some of the results I just showed are explained in this book. So if you want to take a look, please don't hesitate to ask us. We'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you a lot. Thank you, Alexandre.
Thank you, Professor Ana Flávia, for your presentation. It was very enlightening to show the Brazilian perspective, and thanks for adding a very important issue on Antarctica and a more political approach. Before we move to comments and questions part and introduce Vinícius and Lingjie again, I'd like to ask our speakers to check the chat here. We got some questions to Professor Carina, Otto, and Jinyuan Su. So moving to, and I'd like to introduce our first discussant is Vinícius Trindade. Vinícius is a Brazilian diplomat, currently working on the Brazilian mission at the United Nations in New York. He also holds a master's degree on University of Brasilia School of Law. As I said to Professor Barros-Platiau, we are eager to have a more different approach than the legal ones that we saw previously. Thank you, Vinícius. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Alexandre, for the introduction and for handing me the floor. And at the outset, let me also thank the organizers from the University of Wuhan and University of Brasilia for the invitation to be here as a discussant, and also for raising this important issue around the BBNJ negotiations. And personally, it is a pleasure to be here to participating in this discussion as I follow the BBNJ negotiations from the permanent mission of Brazil to the United Nations in New York. But I just want to clarify that I'm here in my personal capacity only, not my official one. And I think that there were many interesting and important points that were raised by the speakers, and that could provide the basis for a very rich discussion. Professor Otto Spijkers touched upon the formal relationship between the BBNJ agreement and UNCLOS. And I think that this is very relevant to parties of UNCLOS, but especially important to countries that are not parties to UNCLOS and wish to become parties to the BBNJ agreement. So this is something that I believe we have to take a very good look on if we want to aim for universal participation and membership in the treaty. And another important topic raised by Professor Carina was on how to avoid international litigation and harmonize this new body of law with existing legal regimes. And we usually tend to focus on how to craft the provisions for the settlement of dispute, but it is indeed equally important to assess what are the necessary measures for dispute prevention, which could enhance cooperation and coordination between the parties. And also the very rich discussion around the adjacency doctrine brought by Professor Su. I think this is also something very important to bear in mind, especially as how it relates to the different chapters in the BBNJ agreement, especially the chapters on area-based management tools and environmental impact assessments. Personally, I think that the adjacency doctrine might be quite challenging when we assess the chapter of marine genetic resources, and also it may raise very difficult questions when we try to regulate access and the sharing of benefits. So it's a very important discussion. And also Professor Ana Flávia raised important points on the Antarctic legal regime and its relationship with the BBNJ agreement. I believe that one of the long-standing discussions in the BBNJ agreement, and that has been reflected in the interventions of the speakers here, is how the BBNJ agreement would not undermine other instruments and bodies and organizations by duplicating existing processes, overlapping existing mandates, right? There is a wide array of existing regional and sectoral bodies, but usually they have a limited mandate depending on their geographic scope or on the activities that they are meant to regulate, such as International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, the Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, the Antarctic Treaty, mentioned by Professor Ana Flávia, and many others. But the challenge is that none of them have the mandate to regulate in a global and holistic manner the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there are clearly regulatory gaps, and especially when it relates to access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources. And I think that this question of the not undermining is also it's a two-way street. You can also ask how these bodies out there would not undermine the BBNJ agreement as well. And perhaps the absence of a BBNJ agreement also puts these regional and sectoral bodies at risk of undermining each other. So it's a very important discussion, and perhaps the answer lies in how we are going to craft the decision-making body of the BBNJ agreement, which is its conference of the parties, in a way that it would promote cooperation and coordination by taking decisions where there are no legal existing regimes, and also recommendations where there are already legal regimes. So for the sake of time, sorry for having extended myself, the question I like to pose relates to the relationship between the BBNJ agreement and other bodies. What safeguards, if any, would you consider that should be included in the BBNJ agreement to ensure that other legal regimes are not undermined, and that the BBNJ agreement may promote cooperation and coordination between these legal regimes? And if we have more time, I also wanted to ask about something particular to the adjacency doctrine and how it relates to the MGR's chapter. To what extent would the adjacency doctrine be compatible or not with the principle of common heritage of mankind, especially as it relates on how we regulate access and benefit sharing in this new body of law? Thank you.
Thank you, Vinícius. Thank you very much for your participation and for being with us here. I'd like to invite again Professor Lingjie Kong for his comments and observations. Professor Kong, please.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think we're about 15 or 20 minutes behind our schedule. So I will be brief and short. I think Naomi already posted a certain question to the speakers. I noticed we have 26 participants in total, and nobody left during the presentation, meaning that we have 4 very excellent presentations. So now let me read certain questions to the speakers so that my students, I'm so happy to see some of my students is online, they can do further research. Let me go first to Otto Spijkers. My colleague, Professor Spijker, discussed about a very fundamental and general issue, the relationship between UNCLOS and the IBO, LBIL for short. He talks about mainly about the certain paragraph in the preamble. If you have the text beside you, that will make my comment and question much easier to follow. So like paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 of the preamble, Article 2 and Article 4 of the revised draft text. So my question for Otto Spijker goes as follows. If we look at UNCLOS, the 1982 convention, we can see in the preamble, the last paragraph says something like, for those matter not governed, not set out by UNCLOS, they should be governed by customary rules of international law. Then we see in Article 293, for all the dispute settlement bodies, they should apply international rules of international law not incompatible with the convention. Now, going back to Article 4 of the revised text, it says something like, nothing in this agreement shall prejudice the right, jurisdiction, and duties of states under UNCLOS. That's the first sentence. That is easy to understand. and not very disputable. But the second sentence goes like, this agreement shall be interpreted and applied in the context of and in a manner consistent with the convention. So my question is, going through all the provision, all the drafted text, Professor Spijker, have you found anything that is inconsistent with the convention? On the other side, on the other side of the story, for this new agreement, it is an implementation agreement, as you mentioned. And the states need to negotiate and try to develop rules of international law. For example, you mentioned Article 206, 204 about environmental impact assessment laid out in UNCLOS. But now in this revised, in this EBRO, there will be more very detailed provision on the implementation of this obligation under international law for BBNJ. So my question is, have you found anything inconsistent? And if you found any, how could we, all the states, try to avoid anything incompatible between the newly established agreement and the already existing convention? My comment to Professor Carina goes like, you talk about case law, that's my favorite. I can keep talking about cases for days and night. A very short comment is, you listed like 18 cases. According to my knowledge and understanding, all the cases concerning, international environmental law, like CBD, the principle, like sustainable development, polluter paid principle, and so on and so forth. The procedural obligation, the substantive obligations. I mean, all the case law, they are relevant. I mean, they are relevant to the new agreement for the negotiation and for interpretation and application in the future. That's a very short comment. And my question goes like, if you look at Article 55 of the revised text, Article 55. Article 55 is on the procedures for the settlement of disputes, right? Have you got that article? So my question is, why you talk a lot about case law helps clarify international law or even national law, national legislations. So they are very helpful. Why do you argue for a new agreement to avoid litigation? So when we look at Article 55 on procedural for dispute settlement, Part 15 of UNCLOS seem to be incorporated fully into this revised draft text. So my question is, how do you see, about the future negotiation on this article when Part 15 is incorporated into this new agreement, meaning state can choose according to Article 287 of UNCLOS the means of dispute settlement. If they do not choose the same means, Annex 7 arbitration, Annex 5 conciliation, and even Annex 8 can be applied. So litigation may not be avoided. So what's your opinion on this? My last question goes to my colleague Jinyuan. Dr. Su and Professor Su talked about the principle of adjacency. I think a certain distinction should be made here. The first distinction is between the principle of adjacency in terms of the law of the sea and in terms of acquisition of territories. In your article, you mentioned certain case law, like in Eritrea-Yemen case arbitration. But there, the Court of Arbitration talks about like a principle of natural unity between the feature and like the territorial sea. And here, in the law of the sea, you talked about coastal state entitlement to zonal area, like the territorial sea, the EEZ, the continental shelf. So coastal states, they are entitled according to the convention. You know, everything had been laid out in the convention. You have to be a coastal state to be entitled to claim either, you know, a maximum 12 nautical mile territorial sea, 200 nautical mile EEZ, or a continental shelf, you know, for 200 nautical miles or even longer. But everything it laid out had been laid out in the convention. So that's the first distinction. The second distinction concerned Article 9, Article 10, and Article 15 of the revised text. You talked about due regard. I think it is completely different from the principle of adjacency or entitlement under the law of the sea or under UNCLOS. They're very, very different. When we look at UNCLOS, we may find due regard, the phrase, you know, the two words, due regard, in many provisions. For example, in the EEZ, Article 59, it lays out, it states something like coastal states in EEZ should pay due regard to the rights of other states, right? And vice versa. Other states, when they exercise their rights, like freedom of navigation in the EEZ of the coastal state, they should pay due regard to the exclusive right of the coastal state over the natural resources. When international law deal with due regard situation, that means there are two equal rights that needs to be balanced and protected. And so when you look at the text of Article 9, Article 10, it deals with certain very specific situations, like the marine genetic resources. They can be found both in area within national jurisdiction and beyond national jurisdiction. So that's why you know, the states prefer a balance between the two rights and legal legitimate interests that need to be protected. And lastly, I think a distinction should be made between due regard rights obligations and transboundary impact and other obligations. If you look at Article 26, it deals with transboundary impact. I think the obligation is based on general international law, right? All the states should undertake the obligation of not to harm or cause substantial damage by activities on a territory or within its jurisdiction to other states. So that's the principle of general international law. And now, if you apply this general principle or general obligation to the procedural obligation of EIA or transboundary EIA, that's how it should be applied. That's my comment. I have spoken for about 10 minutes. I should stop now and leave. I think the speaker, you can choose to respond or not to respond now, you know, as we're far behind our schedule. I thank you for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kong, and thank you as well, and again to Vinícius for both your comments, observations, and questions. Yeah, so we don't have much time available, but I want to open the floor for our speakers. So maybe we can follow the same order of their presentations. Start with Otto, Carina, Professor Su, and then Professor Barros-Platiau. So Otto, are you there?
Yes,
Please.
yes. So I will be very brief. So to respond to Vinícius Trindade's remarks about the role of non-parties to the Law of the Sea Convention that may wish to ratify the new ILB. So actually Article 4, which is on the relationship between the new ILB and the Law of the Sea Convention, has a paragraph 4, which says that the legal status of non-parties to the Law of the Sea Convention with regard to that instrument is not affected by this agreement. But that's a very ambiguous provision, and it's also placed in brackets. So that shows how controversial and how contentious this issue was and still is in the negotiations. Then to Lingjie Kong's question. So he asked me whether there is actually a part in the ILB that might be inconsistent, with the Law of the Sea Convention. Well, I think there is. So there's not a single reference in the ILB to high seas freedoms, not a single one. And the high seas freedoms are a crucial aspect in the balance that is achieved in the Law of the Sea Convention. So this is clearly an inconsistency. And also in the Law of the Sea Convention, there are very few references to the due regard principle. And most of those references in the new ILB to the due regard principle are placed in brackets. So they might actually get removed from the text after further negotiation. And interesting also is that the Law of the Sea Convention indeed affirms that matters not regulated by that convention continue to be governed by the rules and principles of general international law. So that's a reference to customary law. But the new ILB does not refer at all to customary or general international law as a gap filler. I think that's also a very remarkable difference. Thank you.
Carina, please.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I would like to thank for all the questions that were asked here by the discussants and by the people that are following us at YouTube. So I would just read the questions that were the most voted questions in Slido, because there is one or two that were made to me. And the first one is from Julia Vega, and she asked that, shall we define marine scientific research with a wide approach, including all, I will summarize, with a wide approach. And so Julia, I think that no, my answer would be no. And I think that we should define only marine scientific research related to a pure marine scientific research, and then the other definitions such as bioprospecting are different definitions. So my answer would be no. And then a second question from Harvey Mopoto, who is a doctoral student at the law faculty and member from GERN. He asks if taking into consideration the observed limits on the implementation of the concept of common heritage of humankind in the context of UNCLOS. And then he asked, do you think that this concept is still able to help states to manage a common good from the point of view of sharing of genetic resources, for example, or this concept belongs to the past and it will be interested to find another mechanism? So I would say that we should keep this principle in mind, because it's already inside the draft, and it has, even if it's still vague and it has not yet been fully used even for non-living resources, it is still vague for resources in the area. I think we should try to keep it inside the convention, because it would be, well, totally difficult to find another one, and it's really well known under international law, and it's already present at UNCLOS. So we should just we should try to how do we say, to to bring the interpretation in a larger way, in a more extensive way, including marine genetic resources. So this is the answer for Harvey. And then just briefly regarding Professors Lingjie Kong, I did not mention the dispute settlement rules that, as you said, they are under they are quite similar to UNCLOS, and I agree with you that litigation may not be avoided if this procedure keeps in the draft. However, it was not the focus of my presentation. I tried to focus on the substantial contributions, but for sure this is quite an interesting issue to develop later. And then the final one, the question made by Professor Otto, and he said that Article 5 of the revised draft, the principle of common heritage, is put in brackets, meaning that some states like to have it included in the treaty and other states disagree. I believe that this is due to the debate between supporters of the freedom of the seas and those supporting the common heritage of mainland. But why are the high seas freedoms then not mentioned all anywhere in the draft treaty? So I think that the answer is that is based on what you've presented. So UNCLOS have provisions that support the freedom of the seas for different activities. So I think this is why states think that they are already that this provision is already in force, and that the debates on that are not will not be fruitful for during these negotiations. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry for reading the questions, but I thought that it would be important to highlight the content of the questions.
Thank you, Carina. No, not at all. Professor Su, you have the floor,
yes,
please.
Thank you, Alexandra. Let me respond to Otto's question first, and then a question from the audience, and then maybe respond very briefly to my good friend Lingjie's comments. So the first question from Otto is, since the adjacency doctrine or principle is so controversial, whether, why shouldn't we apply the due regard principle? And I think this is what I have been trying to argue for. Throughout the negotiation of BBNJ, I could feel that at some time the so-called adjacency doctrine was very strong, and actually my paper, which was published on audio, arose out of the concern that this very strong doctrine would, help to extend coastal state jurisdiction into the high seas. And I think when the negotiation proceeded gradually, many of the proposals were abandoned, and some are remain there. So one of the examples is which is provided for in Article 15, paragraph 4 of the revised draft text agreement, which provides for the obligation not to undermine the effectiveness of measures in AWNJ. To me, this runs risk of coastal state jurisdiction. For example, if a coastal state applies a very high standard of measures in its AWNJ, and then in order for the measures taken in the ABNJ to not undermine its effectiveness, you would have to match up with those measures, which would potentially hinder, for example, high seas freedom, probably. And this is one of the examples, but we will see how this provision will, whether it will be kept or revised or deleted in the negotiations in the future. So overall, I'm very supportive of the principle of due regard. And second of all, the question from the audience, whether we can design a mechanism like the one in Article 142 of the UNCLOS. And I think this is the direction the negotiation is moving towards. For example, the obligation of a consultation, which presumably comprises the obligation of prior notification, in my point of view. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for a consultation to proceed. But in terms of, if we look at Article 142, we also can see the obligation of the requirement of a prior consent from coastal states. And I think this would not be appropriate to apply in the context of BBNJ. In my point of view, the access and benefit sharing of BBNJ should be location-based, and it should more like following the mechanism for living resources, even those straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. It is a very different story for non-living resources, because they are very easy to apportion between the international community and the coastal states. And finally, very briefly, just to respond to Lingjie's comments, several comments. First of all, I agree there's a distinction, a clear distinction to be drawn between the application of adjacency in the context of maritime entitlement and territorial acquisition. And in my paper, I ventured to also to include those two cases. One is Yemen Eritrea case, as you mentioned, and it is a very different story. And I also tried to highlight this is a completely different story from what we are discussing in the BBNJ. And second of all, with regard to the application of due regard, for example, to the access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources, overall, in terms of access and benefit sharing, I don't think it should be applicable, but it should be applicable in terms of the conservation or protection of those marine genetic resources. You mentioned, I agree, you mentioned that the duty of due regard usually applies to two equal or concurrent competing rights. Maybe it will also be applicable in two rights which do not exist in the same area, but nevertheless have a transboundary impact. Maybe it should be applicable too in the context of preservation or environmental protection as well. It's somewhat related to transboundary, the avoidance of transboundary harm, but I think these two are quite closely connected. And with regard to ABNT and activities conducted in ABNJ, I think yes, the obligation of due regard applies as well. And you also highlighted, the question remains how to apply, for example, the obligation of due regard, the obligation of avoiding transboundary harm to those activities. And I think the state should act in good faith, for example, by giving public information and by initiating or accepting consultation. But this may not always, be fruitful. But if not, in any case, if not, and if the activity continues, and there are harm caused, then there are consequences, in my point of view. So these are my short comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Su. Professor Ana Flávia Barros-Platiau, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alexandre. I only have one question about research in Brazil from Larissa, and I'd like to say the question is about how Brazil should encourage interdisciplinary research. And my answer is we are all promoting more interdisciplinary research in Brazil. Professor Carina is part of a group inside the Ministry of Defense and the CCOM structure, promoting that, like UNESCO motto, change comes from our minds. Our minds means us as individuals, as citizens and society. So social and human sciences are very important to understand how we should build a better ocean governance. That would be my question. May I be very provocative and just say a last word, Professor Alexandre Pereira?
Yes, please. But before you said, I just want to say that I posed incorrectly my question to you. So if you may add your answer. So my question to you was, if you see some political room for Brazil and China improve their polar relations, if not only in bilateral level, eventually under or within the BRICS summit. Please go.
Thank you. Yes, I do. I'm very optimistic about that. My research work funded by CNPq is on China and Brazil for polar research, polar politics. I see two different issues. One of them is there is already some international cooperation, but it's very small and very difficult to find. But it exists, and there's not a clear framework, although our both countries have signed a scientific and technological agreement years ago. And Antarctica demands that polar science demands that scientists cooperate, because we learn by doing, so scientists need each other anyway. So it's I think it's just a matter of a kind of pushing, of doing the first steps, of trying to do something, and then we can connect and go very fast, in my opinion. Very optimistic about that. And the second point, concerning BRICS, I think there were some very nice initiatives concerning ocean governance related to development, environment, climate change, and other global issues, but not polar science, as far as I see from the Brazilian side. BRICS and polar science are still worlds apart. So there's work to be done, but I don't see any clear barrier or big hurdle that would be very difficult to move away. So I'm very happy to be here discussing this with you, because I think this is something that we could invest on in the future. And thank you for your question. And if you want to work on that, please don't hesitate to contact me and Carina. And my final word, very provocative. I think that we should just turn the world around and change the questions. How can we litigate more? How can we undermine the existing agreements because they failed? They're not good, they have gaps. They were crafted like UNCLOS. UNCLOS was crafted in the 80s. It was the Cold War, bipolar order. It was another planet, another balance of power, bipolar order. Now we have a new international order. We have global existential risks. We have climate change that has to be connected with all this discussion. And I feel kind of worried that you are looking a lot at the articles and the technical issues that I cannot follow because I'm not a law professor. But and so I don't understand all you've said, but I propose that we be more provocative in the next time, maybe in 6 months' time or next webinar with you all, and let's say, okay, what needs to be changed? What battles need to be fought now? Next year we'll have Stockholm Plus 50 conference, and they are talking about green recovery. So we have to talk about ocean governance too in this framework. So that's my invitation for debate. Thank you, Professor Alexandre Pereira da Silva. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ana Flávia. So I know we blew the time, but I just want to ask if Vinícius and Lingjie want to add some comments. If not, but please, Vinícius, and eventually, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Professor Alexandre, and also thank you for all the speakers for providing a very important answers. I think that Professor Ana Flávia has a very good point there. There is a saying, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? So sometimes you have to take a broad look into the problems around the world. And I also think the answers from Professor Su and Professor Otto Spijkers, Professor Carina. I think that especially the discussion around the principle of common heritage of mankind is extremely important when we try to regulate and adopt a model of regulation for the MGR's chapter. And perhaps it may be quite challenging to try to adopt a model based on command and control or a permitting or licensing system for this chapter. Maybe a more easier way to regulate this without hampering marine scientific research. On the contrary, in order to foster innovation and marine scientific research would be something based on notification and a self-compliance regulatory model. But this is another discussion, and hopefully we could continue this very fruitful debate and another occasion. But just to thank again for the invitation and for the remarks.
Thank you, Vinícius. Thanks again for your participation. Lingjie, any?
Oh, thanks, Alejandro.
Final words.
I wouldn't add anything more. I would like to say thank you to everyone, especially the speakers and all the participants. I wouldn't hold our student any longer. It's about 10 p.m. Now, but I think this is not the way we're supposed to have, you know, a blended life, you know, to live in this planet. We're supposed to have a cup of premium Brazilian coffee in Brazil, and we're supposed to meet each other and have some very good Chinese food here. That's the way we communicate. You know, when we're not discussing, debate, or argue against each other online, we're you know, having meaningful discussions as members of the intellectual community. So I look forward to meeting you all and hosting you here at Wuhan University. And I expect, you know, more opportunity to live a life, to be real friends, you know, to do what friends should do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Lingjie. I just, of course, join me to your words. And online events are great, but presential events is much more great. So many thanks to all participants, speakers, students, and researchers that follow us on YouTube and Zoom platform. Thank you all. Até uma próxima oportunidade. Xie, zai qian.
Bye.